Hey, Shalom Akim, Shabbat Shalom, all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone, for teaching us his truth, and citations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Brother Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And this is going to be a bit of a self-esteem boost, exhortation, and sincerely praying that this is uplifting, to you brothers, to you Akim that may listen, right? So for today's lesson, the title is that if you don't have a woman, it doesn't make you less of a man. If you don't have a woman, it doesn't mean that you are less of a man, right? And really and truly, I was meditating on a couple of things, and just hearing some of the conversations of people. A lot of these men, something I've noticed, in the society, they overvalue themselves, based on the woman, based on having a woman, right? And it's very, and I remember one of the things one of my elders said to me years ago. He said a woman is a complement to your life, not the focus, right? The scriptures talk about how the whole duty of man is to fear the Most High and keep his commandments, right? And a woman really is supposed to be a complement, an accessory, a helpmeet, right? A pillar of rest, right? But really and truly, a lot of these men in the world, one of the things that I've noticed is that, their whole value, it kind of surrounds this one woman, right? To the point where they do so much, right? And they don't, have a sense of valuing themselves. They kind of essentially kind of like two marbles rolling around in a tin can, and there's absolutely nothing, no value, no substance inside, right? Or they might have some external value, but internally it's just like it's absolute. They're kind of like absolute airheads, right? So let me I actually had typed this into ChatGPT, and I was just curious to what it said. Just bear with me on this. I had typed this into ChatGPT, but I forgot how I worded it. And it essentially, it gave one of the reasons it gave was, if a man has a woman, that is essentially kind of like it's basically kind of like a choosing signal to kind of indicate to other women that his man is desirable, right? But it also gave another answer where a man should have some sort of intrinsic value, and that's one of the words I noticed that stuck out, right? So let me go to the word actually, intrinsic. It says internal, interior. It says inward. It says inner. Inwardly, on the inside, right? Belonging to the nature of a thing. It says, let's see if there's anything else here. So essentially having some sort of internal value. And one of the reasons I notice why a lot of dudes, everything's kind of upside down in this society, because a lot of men don't have intrinsic value, right? That is essentially kind of pulling people, kind of towards them, right? As opposed to, they have a bunch of external value, and they essentially boast in that external value. And the scriptures say that let not a mighty man boast in his might, and let not a rich man boast in his riches, right? So let me start off. I guess I'll start off with this precept. Bear with me. Let me get it real quick. This is Sirach chapter 40, verse 26. And it says, in regards to like the substance, right? Riches and strength lift up the heart, but the fear of the Lord is above them both. There is no want in the fear of the Lord, and it needeth not to seek help. And it's true, there's a certain level of, having riches and strength, possessions, right? Those types of things lift up the heart, right? You know, but in scriptures say that the fear of the Lord is above those things. And a lot of people don't have that. They don't have that kind of conduct. They don't have that sort of wisdom. They don't have that sort of intrinsic value that's essentially kind of pulling people towards them. If anything, people are pulled towards maybe by the physical things that they have, but somebody, but in that case, a woman or people in general might be just being pulled, towards that man for the wrong reasons, just because he has those physical things, right? A lot of those people don't have spiritual substance. They don't have intrinsic value. They don't have a fear of the Lord, right? So, and because I mentioned the word possessions, man, how does that precept go? Gaineth a wife. Hold on. Oh, sorry. Getteth a wife. Wife. It's in Sirach somewhere. Just bear with me. Let me just look for this real quick, because a wife is also a possession too. Let me just modify this. Okay, Sirach 36 verse 24, and it says, He that getteth a wife beginneth a possession, a help unto himself, and a pillar of rest. Right, just to add to the point in regards to, a man who gets a wife, right? She is also likened unto a possession too, right? But, the objective is more striving for intrinsic value, right? As opposed to the value where a lot of these people, a lot of these men, they overly focus on the opposite of intrinsic. I'm not sure what that's called. Maybe it's extrinsic, if I'm not mistaken, right? As a matter of fact, let me look that up real quick just for edification. Of intrinsic. Okay, so it's extrinsic. So intrinsic is essentially relate to the essential nature, character of something, the inherent value, the quality of something possessive, right? Examples include a person's intrinsic motivation or intrinsic properties of a material, right? It says extrinsic is something external on the outside. So your possessions, might have a nice house, a nice vehicle or a nice woman, but this is just an exhortation. You don't feel like less of a person just because you don't have one. Yes, she's a compliment. She's supposed to be a pillar of rest, so on and so forth. But this is the kind of vibe that is very strongly perpetuated in the society, because the society strongly what's the word I'm looking for? It strongly pushes the vibe of a man is he's not as important, right? So for him to kind of feel more important, he needs to feel like he has more of these extrinsic things, right? He needs to have, for example, a woman, right? To him feel like more like somebody who he's validating, to have a girlfriend, so to speak, right? This is something that is strongly pushed, and when you see a lot of these different romance videos and romance movies and so on TV, this is the kind of vibration that is strongly pushed, so a man doesn't feel like he is complete, he's whole. He needs something else to feel. He needs something external to make him feel whole, right? And that's the problem, with this society. right? As opposed to filling up and feeling more whole on the inside, right? So, you know, I wanted to read, this here. This is Genesis chapter 41, um, verse 38. And it says, "And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this, a man whom the Spirit of the Most High is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, For as much as the Most High Yahweh Bashem Shai hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according to thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou." And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, "I have set thee over all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh took off his ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. Right. So what's happening here is, when you see the Pharaoh taking the fancy garb, the fancy linens, and decking him out with a gold chain and so on and so forth, that is the extrinsic value, the external, but that is only manifesting what's actually on the inside. Because Joseph, he was able to essentially break down and give an explanation. He had a thorough understanding of being able to decipher the Pharaoh's dream, right? So he was able, and he was essentially a man of intrinsic value. He was extremely valuable in this situation, right? And he was a man that actually feared the Lord, because when you go back into the earlier in his story, he had, a woman that was the Pharaoh's wife tried to hit on him, right? But he knew it was wickedness, so he fled from her advances, right? So here you're seeing a manifestation of the physical, but it's only translating, because of what's dwelling in Joseph's spirit, because the Lord had his spirit over Joseph to be able to actually be able to properly explain the dream, right? He was able to essentially give an action plan of what to be able to do, right? So he had a very thorough knowledge. He was very knowledgeable, right? And that is something that Jake doesn't pride themselves on in this society. They don't pride themselves on being knowledgeable, knowing certain things. And the scriptures say that, our people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, right? When it comes to, and that's something, and that's the strange thing about this, when you think about the nature of our people, because our people like to brag about ignorance. It's not cool to be ignorant, and they listen to these fools, these musicians, these rappers, these actresses, or whoever, and it thinks that it's cool, it's charming to be ignorant, right? When you look at these other nations, especially people who are well traveled, they strive to actually make themselves more knowledgeable. They have more of a thorough understanding of how, the geopolitics in their country. They have more of an understanding of, how certain things work, how business works. But Jake, even though we're a very, very talented, people, there's a sentiment of just remaining, ignorant, not knowing anything, right? Our forefathers were very, very knowledgeable, and I'm reading an account here of Joseph, of somebody who was very, very knowledgeable, right? Continuing on, this is verse 43, and it says, "And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And here's pretty much the point I kind of wanted to also solidify here, you know. Well, making 2 points. The first point really is showing that Joseph had a sense and had intrinsic value, prior to. I'll read the next point here, actually, the next precept. Sorry. This is verse 45. And it says, and Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath Pinneh, and gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of the Potiphar, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and went out from the presence of the Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt, right? So pretty much the point here is, here he is given to wife this woman here. But the point is, he had a sentiment of intrinsic value prior to also meeting her, right? He was somebody of valuable, somebody of importance, somebody who to be, who has as the Lord Yahweh Bashim Shah has a spirit over. He was a man who actually feared the Lord, going back to the precept I read earlier, right? So he wasn't just a regular Joe Schmo. That's why it's very, very, something I've noticed, it's very, very, good to actually, know things, to be very, very knowledgeable. The scriptures say that don't be to be ignorant in anything great, or small, right? So it's very, very, beneficial, to be able to actually have, knowledgeable, not just any knowledge, but the scriptures still do talk about how the knowledge of wickedness is not wisdom, right? So he had Joseph had is he possessed wisdom, right? So, this is just an exhortation to show that, it's, and this is something that, I myself have felt, you don't want to feel like less of a man just because you don't have a woman, right? Your self-worth, your value, your what's it called, self-esteem, like they say in the world, it shouldn't be tied to a lot of these physical things, right? Do these physical things help? Absolutely, they do help, right? They absolutely do help. I'm not knocking that. If you have a nice vehicle, to, what I'm saying? Like a nice vehicle, those things do help. But this is just more to stress the importance of the intrinsic value, right? Because that's what, as a matter of fact, let me get this last precept here, because this is kind of what exemplifies Joseph, and this also exemplifies, the men of the Lord, the elect in these times, right? Because a lot of these men, they're very essentially mediocre because they have no intrinsic value. Let me go to this is Ecclesiastes 8:1, and it says, who is as the wise man, and who knoweth the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed, right? So this is what wisdom does to a man's face. Kind of like how makeup adorns a woman's face, wisdom adorns a man's face. And Joseph's face was very adorned, and through his wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, this is how wisdom adorns us, because it changes the way he walked, not just physically in the sense how he conducted himself, how he operated, right? So, this is, brothers, don't feel like you're less of a person just because you don't have a woman. You are not less of a person just because you ain't got no woman, right? That's not what makes you valuable as a man, right? You keep the whole, not all of the commandments, but the whole duty of man, right? Fear the Lord, keep his commandments, right? Because when you look at the nature of the way people operate in this world, these people operate as beasts. They operate as savages. There's beast mode. I'm savage, I'm ruthless, and all this kind of shit. Like, no, we don't operate that way, man. You know, we operate as people who have principles, who have morals, scruples, guidance. You know what I'm saying? So, um, anyways, that's pretty much it. You know, just a short exhortation, not to feel and not to get too down on yourself. You know, to, you know, just because you feel like okay, you don't have a woman, it doesn't make you less of a person. You are a very valuable person, right? We're a holy people unto the Lord thy power, right? You know, so anyways, I'll leave it there. But Lord's will, this lesson was edifying, just a little bit of boost for self-esteem. You know, I know sometimes demons plague us and so on and so forth, trying to make us feel like we're less of a person, right? So um I sincerely pray and hope that this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Yahushai Bashem Makakodash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders who are millstone for teaching us his truth. Till next time, I say Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.